My name is Clara Voss. I'm 31 years old. I'm a brand designer living in Amsterdam, and 3 weeks ago, I woke up to 29 missed calls from a number in Germany I didn't recognize. 29. Not one, not two, 29. I stood in my kitchen in my pajamas, staring at that notification, and my coffee went cold in my hand before I ever pressed play on a single voicemail. Because something deep in my body already knew. Something that doesn't live in your brain. It lives lower, in your stomach, in your chest, in the place where old fear hides when you've spent years pretending it's gone. Some memories don't fade the way people tell you they will. They don't soften with time. They just wait. They sit somewhere dark and patient inside you, and then one ordinary Wednesday morning, they drag you back, all the way back, like you never left at all. For me, it wasn't a memory. It was a number on a screen, and 29 missed calls. And suddenly, I was 11 years old again, standing alone inside Frankfurt Central Station, watching the two people who were supposed to love me drive away and laugh. Let me paint you a picture. If you had driven through Heidelberg in the mid-1990s and pulled up in front of our house on a Sunday afternoon, you would have seen exactly what my parents wanted you to see. A wide driveway, a garden with actual flowers in it, my father washing the car in a pressed shirt like it was something he enjoyed, my mother at the kitchen window waving at the neighbors, her hair done, her smile perfect. We looked like the kind of family other people pointed to. My father, Stefan Braun, was an operations manager at a mid-sized logistics firm. Organized, disciplined. The kind of man who always knew where everything was, and who believed that knowing where everything was made him better than most people. My mother, Ingrid, ran the household like a company. She had a schedule for everything. Dinner at 6:30, lights off at 9, homework checked before any television. She used to say the world respected people who had structure. What she didn't say, what she never said out loud, was that the structure wasn't for us. It was for her. It was a system of control, and I was the variable that kept needing to be corrected. To everyone outside that house, we were normal, solid, admirable even. The Braun family, good values, hardworking, strong. Inside, it was different. Inside, love was conditional. Safety was performance-based. And my mother had a gift, a genuine gift, for turning any ordinary moment into a test I didn't know I was taking. She called them lessons. That was always her word. Always. If I forgot my homework, I needed a lesson in responsibility. If I cried, I needed a lesson in toughness. If I asked for help, I needed a lesson in self-reliance. She wrapped cruelty in the language of education so cleanly that for years, I thought the problem was me. I thought I was the one who kept failing. My father backed her up every single time. Not loudly. He wasn't a yeller. He was worse than a yeller, actually. He was a smiler. He would lean against the doorframe with this small, amused grin, like cruelty between him and my mother was some kind of private joke they'd been sharing for years. And I just kept walking in on the punchline. I want you to understand the pattern before I get to the main event, because what happened to me at that train station didn't come out of nowhere. It was the logical conclusion of a childhood of escalating experiments. When I was 8 years old, my mother took me shopping for school shoes. My old ones had split along the seam. I could feel the pavement through the sole when I walked. At the shop, I pointed to a pair. Nothing fancy, just a basic pair of trainers in blue. And I asked if I could have them. My mother went very still. She said I was being spoiled. She said children in this country had no concept of gratitude. Then she told me to sit on the bench outside the shop entrance while she went inside to browse without me. She said, "Sit right there. Don't move. Think about what you just did." I sat there for 2 hours. I watched families walk in and out. I watched other children carry bags with happy faces. I counted tiles on the floor to keep from crying because I already knew, even at 8, that crying would only make things worse. When my parents finally came out, my father handed my mother a 20-mark note and said, "Told you she'd still be there." She laughed. He laughed. They had made a bet on me, on whether I'd wait or whether I'd wander off. They drove home without buying me shoes. I wore the split ones for another 3 weeks. When I was 9, my father came to collect me from a birthday party at a classmate's house. I was the last one picked up, the last by almost 2 hours. When he finally arrived, he didn't apologize to the host. He said the traffic had been fine. He said I should have used the time to help tidy up. On the drive home, I made the mistake of saying I had been worried he wasn't coming. He found that hilarious. He actually pulled the car over so he could look at me properly while he laughed. He said, "What did you think was going to happen to you, Clara? You think the world is going to stop because you're nervous?" I stared out the window and said nothing. I had already learned that saying nothing was the safest option. When I was 10, I came second in a regional drawing competition. Second. Out of 43 students from 6 different schools. I came home with my certificate and a small trophy, and my face probably showed exactly how proud I was, which, looking back, was the mistake. My mother took the certificate. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Who came first?" "A boy from Stuttgart." She asked if I knew him. I said no. She nodded slowly and placed the certificate on the kitchen counter like it was a grocery receipt she'd look at later. My father said, "Second is just the first loser." Then he went back to his newspaper. I took the trophy upstairs and put it at the back of my wardrobe where I didn't have to look at it. I drew constantly in those years. I drew on the backs of envelopes, in the margins of school books, on cheap paper I bought from my own small allowance. I drew windows looking out onto open roads, women standing alone at the tops of hills. I drew doors without any rooms behind them. I was 11 years old. I didn't understand what any of it meant. But I know now that I was trying to draw myself somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't home. It was a Saturday in October when everything changed. The night before had been bad. Not dramatically bad. There was no screaming. There was never screaming. It was quiet bad, which was always worse. I had come home with a school report that had a B in art, my best subject, the only subject that made me feel like I existed properly, and my mother had treated it like a personal failure. She said if art was the thing I supposedly cared most about, and I still couldn't manage an A, then maybe I didn't care about anything as much as I thought I did. My father said maybe I was getting lazy. I sat in my room that night listening to them talk in the kitchen. Their voices were low and amused. That particular tone, low and amused, was always the worst sign. It meant something was being planned, something involving me. The next morning, they were different people. My mother made Pfannkuchen, pancakes, from scratch. My father whistled while he made coffee. He asked me if I wanted orange juice with actual warmth in his voice. They told me we were going on a day trip to Frankfurt, just the 3 of us, just for fun. I want to stop here and be honest with you about something. For one single, stupid, desperate moment, I believed them. I was 11. I was tired of being afraid, and part of me, the part that never fully stopped wanting them to be normal parents, heard, Day trip, just for fun, and thought, maybe this is different. Maybe the report card fight is over. Maybe this is their version of sorry. I know. I should have known better. The signs were right there in front of me the whole drive to Frankfurt. My father kept the music loud and drummed on the steering wheel. My mother kept turning around from the passenger seat to ask me questions, strange questions. Did I think I was clever? Did I think clever girls knew how to handle real situations? Did I think life would wait for me if I got frightened? Every answer I gave made her smile. Every time I went quiet, she pushed harder. By the time Frankfurt's skyline appeared through the window, my stomach was coiled tight. That familiar feeling, the one that said something was coming and I wouldn't be allowed to brace for it. We parked near Frankfurt Central Station, Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof, just before noon. If you've never been, let me tell you, that station is not a building. It is a city under a roof. 24 platforms, thousands of people at any given moment. Business people with briefcases, families with strollers, students with heavy backpacks moving in every direction at once. There are restaurants and pharmacies and newsstands and departure boards that click and update every few seconds, and the noise of it all presses against you from every direction. I had never been anywhere like it. I stayed close to my parents because I didn't know what else to do. I focused on my mother's coat, dark green, wool, so I wouldn't lose her in the crowd. Inside the main hall, beneath the great arched ceiling, my mother stopped near a wide concrete pillar close to the central entrance. She pointed to the spot at the base of the pillar. She said, "Wait right here while Papa and I move the car and get something to eat. 15 minutes, maybe 20. I asked if I could go with them. My father laughed, loudly. A couple walking past turned to look. He said I was 11, not an infant. My mother bent slightly and said very quietly, close to my ear, "Don't embarrass us." So I stayed. I watched them walk away through the crowd, my mother's green coat, my father's gray jacket. They didn't look back. I stood at that pillar and I counted the seconds. 15 minutes passed. I told myself traffic. I told myself a queue at the restaurant. 30 minutes. I told myself they'd gotten lost finding the car. 45 minutes. My hand started shaking. 1 hour. I walked 3 feet away from the pillar and then rushed back because they'd told me not to move. Even then, even with panic rising in my throat, I was still terrified of doing the wrong thing. That tells you everything about what years of this kind of childhood does to a person. It doesn't teach you to be brave. It teaches you to freeze. The station got louder. The departure boards kept changing. Every announcement over the speakers made my heart spike. Every woman with dark hair made me turn my head. Every set of automatic doors opening brought a rush of cold October air and a new flood of strangers. I had 12 marks in my jacket pocket. No phone, no address written down, no idea how the trains worked. I had never felt so small in my entire life. It was nearly 90 minutes after they'd left me when I saw our car. I saw it through the glass of the station's front entrance, moving slowly along the drop-off lane outside. I recognized the dark blue hood. I recognized the dent above the rear wheel arch from where my father had caught a post in a car park last summer. My whole body jolted. Relief hit me so hard I actually laughed, a short, breathless sound, and I ran toward the glass doors, waving both arms over my head. My chest was flooding with something warm because they came back. They came back. They actually came back. My father was driving. My mother was in the passenger seat. Both of them were looking directly at me. And then I saw my father's face. He wasn't relieved. He wasn't searching the crowd the way a parent searches when they've been separated from their child and they're worried. He was smiling. That specific smile. The private smile. The one he gave my mother when he thought something was funny that I wasn't in on yet. The car slowed. My mother rolled down her window. She leaned out just enough so her voice could reach me over the traffic noise. She shouted, 10 Euro, sagt mir, du findest nicht mal alleine nach Hause. 10 euros says you can't even find your own way home. Then she laughed. My father lifted one hand off the steering wheel in a slow, deliberate thumbs up, the kind you give someone who just told a decent joke, and then he accelerated, and the car moved away from the curb and merged into traffic and disappeared. That was it. That was the moment. Not the leaving earlier, not the waiting. This. Seeing them look at me through that glass, seeing them choose this. Seeing my terror wasn't a side effect of what they were doing, but the point of it. That was the moment the world split in half. Before that moment, some part of me had believed it might still be a misunderstanding, a bad lesson gone too far, a mistake they would feel guilty about later. After that moment, I knew the truth. My fear was the entertainment. I stood frozen on the other side of that glass while people streamed around me, and the warm feeling in my chest curdled into something I had no name for yet. I was 11 years old, and I had just understood something that children should never have to understand about the people who are supposed to love them. I went back inside because I didn't know what else to do. I walked from one end of the main hall to the other, then back again, then again. I was crying, not loudly. I'd been trained not to cry loudly. But the tears kept coming, and I kept wiping them away with my sleeve because my parents had spent years making me ashamed of being upset in public. That's the part I want you to sit with. The fact that even in that moment, abandoned, terrified, with strangers rushing past me in every direction, I was still performing the version of myself my parents had built, wiping my eyes, staying quiet, trying not to take up too much space with my pain. They weren't even there anymore, and I was still following their rules. I thought about calling someone. I couldn't think of anyone to call. My grandparents lived 3 hours away, and I didn't have their number memorized. My friends were school friends. I didn't know their home numbers. I thought about going to the police, but my parents had always told me that if I ever caused trouble with authorities, it would make everything worse for the whole family. I thought about asking a stranger for help, but asking strangers for help was weakness, and weakness attracted worse treatment. That's what I'd been taught. Do you understand what they did? They spent years training me not to trust anyone. And then they left me in a place where trust was the only thing that could have saved me. I sat on a bench near a row of vending machines. I stood up again. I walked in circles. My legs hurt. At some point, the light outside the high windows began to shift, late afternoon gold turning to early evening gray. The crowds thinned and refilled. My thoughts stopped forming complete sentences. I was running on instinct and fear. I don't know how long I had been doing this, maybe 2.5 hours, maybe 3, when someone finally stopped. Her name was Frau Kellner. She worked for DB, Deutsche Bahn, the National Rail Service, in a customer assistance role. She was somewhere in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the kind of calm, unhurried voice that made you want to tell the truth even when everything in you was trained to lie. She had apparently noticed me passing the same row of seats and vending machines multiple times. She stopped me near a corridor leading toward the administrative section and asked, simply, if I was all right. I said yes, automatically. She asked if I was waiting for someone. I said my parents. They were just parking the car. She looked at me for a moment. Then she asked, very gently, how long ago they'd gone to park the car. I didn't answer. I stared at the floor. And then she asked the question that broke every wall I'd built that afternoon. She asked if I'd eaten anything. I don't know why that was the one that did it. Maybe because hunger is so basic. Maybe because it reminded me of how many hours had passed since breakfast. Maybe because it was the first time in those 3 hours that an adult had asked about my needs rather than their own convenience. I started crying in a way I hadn't cried all afternoon. Not careful, quiet tears, real ones, ugly ones. All the panic and shame and exhaustion of 3 hours of being 11 and alone in the biggest building I'd ever been in came out of me in one rush. Frau Kellner crouched slightly so her face was level with mine. She said clearly and without drama, "You are safe right now. I am going to help you. Let's go find somewhere to sit." Security was called first, then the station's duty officer, then the federal police, Bundespolizei, who patrol railway stations. An officer named Bauer, a woman with close-cropped hair and careful eyes, sat across from me with a notepad and asked me everything I could tell her. My name, my parents' names, our address, the name of the firm my father worked for. Another officer pulled the station's camera footage from the entrance. The footage showed our car slowing near the drop-off lane. It showed my mother leaning out of the window. It showed the car pulling away. That footage mattered later. At the time, all I understood was that the adults in the room had gone very quiet and very serious. Officer Bauer made a phone call. I could only hear her side of it. She spoke in a measured, professional tone that slowly lost its neutrality as the call went on. I watched her expression shift, from careful and procedural to something closer to open disbelief, in the span of about 30 seconds. She said, "Sir, your daughter has been alone in this station for nearly 3 hours." A pause. "No, I understand your position. I'm going to explain to you what the law says about that position." Another pause. Longer. Then she said the words I will remember for the rest of my life. Leaving an 11-year-old child unattended in a major transit station is not a lesson in independence. Under German law, it is child endangerment. My whole body went cold. Not because the words were too strong, because they fit. Because hearing someone say it out loud, say it plainly, without softening it, without calling it a difficult situation or a parenting disagreement, felt like oxygen entering a room where I'd been slowly suffocating. I was told I would spend the night with a registered emergency foster family while a formal report was prepared. I was terrified. Everything I'd been told about being taken away ran through my head. All the stories adults use to keep children compliant. But then I met Thomas and Renate Bernhardt. Thomas was a semi-retired schoolteacher with ink stains on his left hand and a habit of making terrible puns and immediately explaining them as if the explanation was part of the joke. Renat taught primary school part-time and smelled faintly of hand cream and coffee and old paperbacks. Their house was warm and slightly cluttered in the way that says people actually live here rather than people perform living here for guests. There was a lamp on in the hallway, a dog basket in the corner with a sleeping retriever in it, children's drawings pinned to a corkboard in the kitchen, from nieces and nephews, I later learned. Renat asked if I wanted soup or toast or both. Thomas asked if I preferred the door ajar or closed when I slept. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody made anything a performance. When I started crying silently at the dinner table and couldn't eat, Renat just quietly moved the plate to the side and put a glass of warm apple juice in front of me instead, and said nothing about it. That first night in their spare room, I barely slept. Every car on the street outside made me flinch. Every creak in the hallway made me sit up straight. But through all of it, one thought kept circling. A stranger in a train station had shown me more genuine care in 5 minutes than my mother had shown me in years. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand that warmth is something some people give without conditions, without bets, without lessons, you cannot keep calling coldness normal. The legal process took months. Youth welfare authorities, Jugendamt, opened a formal case. A court-appointed psychologist evaluated me, evaluated my parents, reviewed the station footage, interviewed teachers, neighbors, and our family doctor. My parents showed up to every hearing with a lawyer and the same attitude they had always had at home: calm, mildly offended, slightly amused that anyone was treating this as seriously as they were. My mother wore a gray blazer and her Sunday earrings, like respectability was a costume that would solve everything. My father sat with his arms folded and his chin slightly raised, like this was a bureaucratic inconvenience he would eventually outlast. Here's the part that still astonishes me when I think about it. They didn't deny leaving me at the station. They admitted it, freely, without hesitation. They just insisted it had been reasonable, structured, intentional. My mother said they were building resilience. My father said European children had become too fragile. He actually used the phrase character development. I sat across from them in that room and understood something that changed me perhaps as fundamentally as the station itself. They were never going to become different people. If they had been capable of seeing what they'd actually done, if they'd had that honesty inside them, they would have turned the car around on the Autobahn before they ever reached the first exit. The court-appointed psychologist's report used words like emotional abuse, systematic humiliation, deliberate endangerment, and a documented pattern of using fear as a parenting tool. Those were not my words, but hearing them read aloud in that room felt like a window opening. For years, I had blamed myself. Because blaming yourself is easier than accepting that the people responsible for your safety had been choosing harm on purpose. The report made it plain. This had not been a misunderstanding. This had not been strict parenting. This was abuse, with a middle-class vocabulary. When the judge asked if I wanted to return home under court supervision, I said no before she'd finished the sentence. My mother looked at me like I'd slapped her. My father muttered something I couldn't quite hear, but the word ungrateful was somewhere in it. The judge didn't flinch. The court offered my parents a path back: parenting classes, family therapy, supervised contact, a structured, monitored reunification process spread over 2 years. My father complained primarily about what it would do to their reputation at work. My mother said she would not allow the state to dictate how she raised her child. And then they were given the choice. Commit to the full reunification program and meet every requirement for 2 years. Or voluntarily relinquish parental rights. They chose to relinquish. I want you to hold that for a moment. I want you to understand what that means. They gave me up. Rather than sit in a room with a therapist once a week, rather than admit to a judge that they had made serious mistakes, rather than endure the oversight of people who would hold them accountable for how they treated their own child, their pride was worth more to them than I was. I did not fall apart in the courtroom. I had expected to. I had spent months preparing for how much that moment would hurt. Instead, my chest went very still. A strange, cold kind of quiet. Like something that had been vibrating in me for years had simply stopped. I had spent my entire childhood trying to be good enough that they would choose me. In the end, they answered the question themselves. After the case closed, formal adoption proceedings began. Thomas and Renata had already expressed their wish to adopt me months earlier, and the process, while slow on paper, had already happened emotionally long before any document was signed. Thomas left art books on my desk, not with any announcement or instruction. He'd just leave them there, open to a page he thought I might like. Klimt, Hockney, Egon Schiele. Renata knocked before entering my room, which sounds like the smallest possible thing until you have grown up in a house where privacy was a privilege that got revoked as punishment. They learned which foods triggered bad memories. They stopped asking me to make eye contact when I was upset. They didn't demand gratitude or immediate warmth or proof that their care was landing. They just stayed. Steadiness can feel almost supernatural to a child who has never had it. Healing was not linear. I want to be clear about that because I think people want stories where the rescue fixes everything, where the damaged child blossoms the moment she lands somewhere safe. My recovery was messy and slow and full of regressions. If Renata said she'd be back in 20 minutes after going to the shops, I fought the urge to stand at the window until I saw her car. If Thomas was late picking me up from school because of traffic, the panic built so fast it made my hands go numb. I hated waiting in public. I hated the phrase, "I'll be right back." I hated train stations for years. Therapy helped. Long, slow work. The kind where you say the same ugly, true things out loud over and over until your nervous system starts to believe what your mind already knows. I learned the words hypervigilance and emotional abuse and trauma response. I learned that surviving cruelty doesn't make you stronger in the way cruel people like to claim. It makes you expert at danger and terrible at rest. But I kept drawing, through all of it. Sketchbooks filling, then another one, then another. Art became not just escape, but structure and language, and evidence that I could create something beautiful without anyone's approval. When it came time to change my name, I didn't hesitate. Clara Braun was the girl who had stood in Frankfurt Central Station with 12 marks in her pocket and no idea whether her own family considered her worth turning a car around for. Clara Bernhardt was someone else entirely. I studied graphic design at a university in Hamburg, moving toward a city with a major train station, choosing to be there, choosing to exist in it, was not symbolic at first. It was practical. But somewhere in those years, I understood I was taking something back. I was relearning that stations were just buildings, that cities were just places, that geography stopped being threatening the moment you stopped being held hostage in it. After graduating, I worked for a small agency in Hamburg for 3 years, then took a position in Amsterdam with an international design studio. Dutch directness suited me. The flat light suited me. The canals and the cycling and the particular Northern European calm of it all suited me. I eventually built my own practice. Brand identity work mostly, helping small companies articulate clearly who they are and what they stand for. The irony of that was not lost on me. My entire career grew out of the fact that I had spent my childhood trapped inside a family that was expert at projecting a false image. I knew exactly how dangerous an inauthentic identity could be, and I knew exactly what it cost people when the truth finally came out. I met Dan at a dinner party hosted by a mutual friend. He was a structural engineer, patient in a way that didn't feel performed, difficult to rattle, excellent at listening without waiting for his turn to speak. On our third date, I told him I had a complicated family history. On our fifth, I told him a little more. 4 months later, when I told him the whole thing, the station, the car, the thumbs up, the €10 bet, he didn't interrupt or overreact or offer me some comfortable cliche about everything happening for a reason. He reached across the table and took my hand and said, "That should never have happened to you." The simplicity of it almost undid me. We built our life deliberately, slowly, with room for honesty. We got married in a small ceremony in a converted farmhouse outside Harlem, with Thomas walking me down the aisle and Renate crying quietly into a handkerchief she had brought specifically for the purpose, having apparently learned nothing about pretending she wasn't emotional. We have a dog named Otto, a rescue greyhound with anxious eyes and a habit of pressing himself against legs when he's unsure of things. He and I understood each other immediately. I blocked every contact method my biological parents ever used: phone numbers, email addresses, social media requests. I had changed my number once already after a voicemail from a German number left me shaking for 40 minutes over nothing more than the sound of my mother's voice asking if I might want to come home for Christmas. I didn't visit Heidelberg. I didn't use my old name. I went entire months without thinking of Clara Braun at all. That was my life when the missed calls came in. A good marriage, a studio I was proud of, morning runs along the Amstel, dinners with friends who were chosen, not assigned, Sunday video calls with Thomas and Renate. A life so quiet and whole that sometimes the peace itself felt faintly suspicious, the way it always does when you grew up waiting for something to go wrong. Then, 29 missed calls from a German number hit my screen, and the ground under all of it shifted. There was a voicemail, then an email from an address I didn't know, then a connection request on LinkedIn, the one platform I'd kept professionally public. That detail told me everything. Someone had worked to find me. Someone had connected Clara Bernhardt, brand designer in Amsterdam, back to the girl they had once bet money on through a car window. I sat at my kitchen counter with my phone in my hand while Otto pressed against my leg, and Dan watched my face go white. I played the voicemail. It wasn't my mother. It was a voice I hadn't heard since the owner of it was a small girl in mismatched socks, following me down a hallway, too young to understand why the air in our house always felt so charged. My younger sister, Mia. Her voice was older, rougher in the way voices get when years have pressed hard on them. She sounded like someone who had been practicing this call for a while before finally making it. She said our mother had been diagnosed with cancer. She said our father had suffered a minor stroke 8 months earlier and his recovery had been slow. She said the family home was gone, sold at a loss 18 months ago. And the specific reason things had fallen apart for them so completely was something I had not expected. It had started with a Facebook comment. My mother, in what I can only describe as a staggering act of self-sabotage, had left a comment on a local community group's post about modern parenting. The post was about how children today lacked discipline. My mother, apparently unable to resist, had written a lengthy response about the importance of hard lessons and building grit and how parents who coddled their children were doing them a disservice. A former neighbor read it. That former neighbor knew what had happened 20 years ago. She made a reply. And then the door opened. Old acquaintances, former colleagues, a retired court administrator who probably should have stayed silent, but didn't. Someone who'd found a brief local newspaper mention from the time of the custody investigation. A former employee from my father's firm who had stories of his own about how they treated people behind closed doors. The image my parents had spent decades polishing in Heidelberg collapsed, publicly and fast and ugly. Customers stopped coming. People drove to the next town rather than spend €1 in a shop connected to that name. Church groups went quiet. Social invitations stopped. Willow Creek, Heidelberg, which had once protected them with polite silence, turned on them with exactly the same tools they'd always used: gossip, reputation, social standing. Now they were in a rented apartment outside the city. No home, no standing. No version of the family they'd constructed left to hide inside. And they wanted me to come back. Not because they had changed, Mia was clear about that. Not because 20 years had made them honest or brave or capable of facing what they'd done. Because they were out of options and frightened of dying alone, and I was apparently the last resource they hadn't tried yet. I asked Mia why she was calling, if she knew I had every reason not to answer. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Because I wanted you to hear it from someone who isn't going to lie to you." She told me she had cut contact too, not 20 years ago, recently. After having her own son, she had requested the original court documents to understand what had actually happened the year I disappeared from the family. My parents had told her a version, that I had overreacted, that the state had overreached, that the foster family had manipulated a confused child. She had believed that version for most of her life. Reading the actual report, she said, felt like being hit by something physical. She looked at her son afterward, her small, trusting boy, and understood with absolute clarity that she would never allow those people unsupervised access to him. Hearing that should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt like exhaustion, the deep kind, the kind that lives underneath anger. She asked if I would come. I said I would think about it. Dan told me I owed them nothing. He said it without drama and without pressure, which is exactly why I've built my life with him. Renata told me whatever I chose had to be for my peace, not their comfort. Thomas, who almost never offers opinions unless asked, said very quietly, "Some people only look for the bridge after they've burned the house down." I sat with all of it through the night. By morning, I knew one thing clearly. I was not going back to save them. I was going back to finish it in my own voice, on my own terms, in person. I flew into Frankfurt 2 days later, drove a rental car to the hospital outside Heidelberg where my mother was receiving treatment, walked through corridors that smelled like disinfectant and recycled air, found the room. My father looked older than I had imagined, smaller too. Illness has a way of stripping the performance away from people, and without the performance, he was just an ordinary man in a hospital chair who had made 20 years of the wrong choices. My mother was sitting up in bed with her hair done and her face arranged. Even there, even in a hospital gown, like dignity was something she could apply in the mirror before visitors arrived. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then my mother's eyes filled and she said my name, my old name. I corrected her once, quietly, firmly. Clara. Just Clara. She nodded and dabbed at her eyes. Then my father cleared his throat and said they had made mistakes. The word he used was Fehler, mistakes. I looked at him for a moment. I said, "A mistake is missing a motorway exit. A mistake is forgetting to buy bread. What you did was not a mistake. You planned it. You drove to Frankfurt with a child in the back seat knowing exactly what you were going to do. You left me in a building I'd never been in a city I didn't know, with 12 marks and no phone. And then you drove past me, slowly, and looked me in the eye and laughed and made a bet on whether I'd survive it. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. And you made it 100 times before that day, and you would have kept making it." My father started to speak. I kept going. I told them the stores were gone because people found out who you really are. I told them the house was gone because the story you told about yourselves was never true. I told them their friends had gone quiet because silence is the only honest response some people have to finding out they were deceived. I told them Mia had gone because she looked at her son and couldn't pretend anymore. My mother asked if I could forgive them. I thought about that for a moment. The real question. What forgiveness actually means. I said, "Forgiveness isn't a debt I owe you because you're sick. You're not asking me to forgive you. You're asking me to come back. Those are completely different things." She started crying. My father started crying. And for the first time in my life, their tears didn't move me. Not because I'm cold, not because I'm without empathy, but because I had spent 11 years being taught that my tears were entertainment. And somewhere in the 20 years since, I had learned that tears alone are not evidence of anything except that someone is upset. They don't tell you who's right. They don't tell you who's sorry. They don't tell you what's going to be different next time. I stood up. My father asked if this was really goodbye. I looked at him, this smaller, older, ordinary man, and I said, "You bet 10 euros that I couldn't find my own way home." I did. I just didn't come back to yours. I walked out. In the hospital car park, the October air was thin and cold and bright. I stood next to the rental car with my keys in my hand, and I let myself feel what was moving through me. Not triumph exactly, not the dramatic satisfaction I had sometimes imagined this moment would bring. Something quieter, something more like the specific release that comes when a thing that has been haunting you finally has a shape you can leave behind. I had been carrying the weight of what happened in Frankfurt Central Station since I was 11 years old. Not just the event itself, the waiting, the panic, the car window, the thumbs up, but the question underneath it, the one I had never been able to stop asking. Why wasn't I enough to make them turn around? Standing in that car park, I understood that the question had always been the wrong shape. I had been answering a question about my value using evidence from people who were fundamentally incapable of seeing it. That's like asking a broken scale to tell you how much you weigh and then building your entire self-image on the number it gives you. I wasn't too little for them. They were too broken for me. There is a difference. Learning it, really learning it in your body, not just in your head, is the hardest and most important thing I have ever done. On the flight back to Amsterdam, I thought about the girl at Frankfurt Central Station, the one who had stood by the pillar watching the clock, the one who had run toward a glass door waving both arms because she thought, for 1 second, that the people who were supposed to love her had come back for her. The one who had spent 3 hours alone in a building full of strangers, following rules that had been designed to keep her helpless, because she had been taught that asking for help was weakness, and weakness attracted worse treatment. She had believed that being abandoned meant being unwanted forever. She was wrong. She was unwanted by 2 broken people who had mistaken cruelty for strength. But she was not unworthy of love. And that is not the same thing. It has never been the same thing. If there is anything I want you to take from this, anything, it's that. Abuse does not become discipline because the person delivering it uses educated language. Humiliation does not build character. It builds hypervigilance and shame, and an 11-year-old girl walking in circles in a train station, trying not to take up too much space with her own fear. And walking away from people who hurt you, even if they are your parents, even if they are sick, even if everyone around you is calling it heartless, is not bitterness. It is not coldness. Sometimes it is the most honest and the most life-preserving thing you will ever do. I did not leave that hospital feeling guilty. I left feeling like myself, fully, for perhaps the first time without any residue of the old question. The family you are born into can shape your wounds, but it does not own your future. Real love doesn't put you in a station and laugh when you panic. Real family doesn't bet on whether you can survive without them. Real healing starts the moment you stop calling cruelty by softer names. And once you do that, once you can actually call it what it was, you can build a life so honest, so steady, and so full of quiet joy that the people who once bet against you will never be able to take it back.